Hello, everyone. My name is Gitika Gorthy, and today I am joined and very honored to be interviewing a very special space champion, Mr. Causey. Mr. Causey has followed the space program since 1961 when he watched on black and white television in his elementary school gymnasium astronaut Alan Shepard become the first American in space. I know, like all of us who are interested in space and look up to a bunch of astronauts, Mr. Causey was like us. Trained as a lawyer who started his legal career on Capitol Hill, Mr. Causey later worked at the United States Department of Justice, the American Red Cross, the District of Columbia Office of the Attorney General, and in private law practice. He taught for more than 3 decades at the Georgetown University Law Center. Mr. Causey has served on numerous historical, educational, and literary society boards. Mr. Causey is also an amazing author of the amazing eye-opening book, John Houbolt, The Unsung Hero of the Apollo Moon Landings. And I actually have a signed copy of the book, and I just have to say, I'm reading it right now. It is one of the best books I've read, and I've learned so much. Like, it really sheds light on a lot of the political things that were happening that I didn't even know before. And it talks about some amazing engineers I had no idea actually were a part of this amazing project. So it's definitely a book that I'm excited to finish reading and would recommend. And I was shocked by the amazing facts I learned about the historical launch. So everyone has to check it out, and we'll talk more about it today and the inspiration behind it. So I can't wait to talk with Mr. Causey's motivation behind writing his amazing book and his journey into the space industry. So welcome, Mr. Causey. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to conduct this interview.
Well, Getika, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you and to talk with you about my book and other things. And I think it's great what you're doing, and it's inspiring. And John Houbolt would certainly have approved of your efforts. So it is a good story, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you and your readers and your followers.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited to learning about really how you got into the space industry and what was your inspiration behind writing the book. But before, I'd like to know about your typical day. What do you currently do and how does it run? I mean, by typical, of course, the pandemic typical.
Sure. Well, I retired about 3 years ago, and in fact, I retired to actually finish writing the book. And the book came out in March of 2020, a year ago, right when the pandemic started. So it's probably not the best time to publish a book, but it's worked out well. And uh, so I do, I'm on the National Air and Space Museum's docent committee. We have over 300 docents at the Air and Space Museum, and I'm in charge of the docents who do the Saturday tours at the museum downtown. Now, of course, the museum has been closed with COVID, but we're probably going to open up pretty soon, and we're doing some renovation and transformation work at the museum. So when it opens up and you go back down there, and I know it's everyone's favorite museum.
Yes, of
uh,
course. I literally have a picture of Twitter on me when I was a little kid, in front of the astronauts there. I love that museum. I used to go there like every month. It was amazing.
well, it'll look very different when you go back, because we're
Oh,
changing it quite a bit and adding a lot of new exhibits and artifacts, and it'll be quite exciting. So I spend a lot of time during my day doing work with the docents and the museum. I'm also on a board, a committee here at the building where my wife and I live, that is helping redo the whole air conditioning and heating system in the building. And we live in a building with 107 units. So it's a big building, and that's been a demanding project, and it's keeping me busy. Um, and I read a lot. I read not only about space material to keep me current, because with the Artemis program of going back to the moon, there's a lot now coming out about that. And Sally and I take walks. We try and walk every day when it's nice weather, to be up and about and around. So surprisingly, our days are fairly busy, and we like it that way. So it's worked out well.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys are keeping yourself busy and you've, immersed yourself in different activities that you love to do. And I can definitely see the passion, flying through the screen. So I'm really glad that you're able to do what you love on an everyday basis.
Of course, one of the great things that Sally likes to do is the Girl Scouts.
Yes,
So
of course. I love Girl Scouts too. I've been a Girl Scout since kindergarten, so it's just an amazing program and has allowed me to meet so many amazing professionals like yourself and your wife.
right.
Yeah. So now I'm actually really just going to jump to the question. It's just, what was your inspiration behind writing this book? I'm really curious because you're in the policy side of things. So how were you able to discover this story and really find inspiration for writing it?
Well, that's a good question. And as you said when you introduced me, I've always been, pardon me, very interested in the space program ever since I was a little kid. In fact, there's a story I tell in the very beginning of the book. On my 13th birthday, I had the flu and I was home in bed, and my parents gave me a book about the space program. And of course, there wasn't much out about the space program at that time. But, excuse me, being in bed, of course, with the flu, I read it probably 4 or 5 or 12 times. And it really got me interested in the whole space program. And a month later, John Glenn made his famous flight of being the first American in orbit. So that really got me excited about space, and I'd always followed space ever since then. Occasionally, I would go over to NASA headquarters. I lived in Baltimore when I was growing up, but I would take the train and I would come over to Washington and I would go through NASA headquarters, and I'd get my arms full of material that their public information office would give me, and photographs and books they
Awesome.
would hand out. So I was quite enthusiastic about all that. And then about 17 or 18 years ago, I became a docent at the Air and Space Museum. So I would be giving tours every other week, and I loved doing that. And that kept me interested. And I got to meet lots of astronauts and lots of people in the space programs. So that was thrilling. So that really spurred my interest. And then about this particular book about John Houbolt, I read a book in 1995 written by a professor named James Hansen, and he made a reference to Houbolt in his book. And I got really interested in Houbolt's story about coming up with the idea of lunar orbit rendezvous, how we got to the moon. And I started doing some research, and I couldn't find anything on John Houbolt. There was very little written about him, and he was yet such a obviously an
Integral.
important,
Yeah.
important figure in the program. So I contacted Professor Hansen, and we got to know each other. And he said, "Well, Bill," he says, maybe you ought to write your own book about John Houbolt." And
Yeah. I
that's
didn't
exactly
know about him until I read the book.
yeah. Well, that's exactly what I did. And I started doing a lot of research, and I went and visited Langley Research Center down in Hampton, Virginia, where John worked. I visited Huntsville, where they built the Saturn V rocket. I went to Cape Kennedy. I went down to Houston, to the Johnson Space Center. I did all my research. This is while I still had a day job.
Wow.
And then, and then when I had all my research together, and that took about 10 years to do, I decided, well, I got to sit down now and just write the book. So that's when I retired and wrote the book. And Professor Hansen, I sent a copy of the draft to him, and he liked it. And he, at that time, had just become editor of a program at Purdue University to publish books about space. And Professor Hansen said, "I think you should submit your book to Purdue." And of course, Purdue University is probably one of the top aeronautical engineering schools in the country. And I submitted the manuscript to Purdue. They were really excited about it, which made me very excited about it. And they agreed to publish it, and they did a great job. So that's how I got from there to there.
That's amazing. I can definitely see the dedication of the research. I mean, finding all this information, especially when it's not accessible very easily, it's difficult. And you piecing everything together is just amazing. I definitely think it's a talent. I think writing itself is a big skill, and I'm really, think you have a lot of it. So when you were processing, and publishing this book, did you reach out to others apart from the professor that you originally talked with? Were there like other colleagues maybe that you talked to and really talked about this book with others?
Well, there were a number of incidents that occurred that kind of got me really excited about this book. One was during the 40th anniversary of Apollo 11, which was in 2009, the three astronauts, Neil Armstrong was still alive at that time, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins, came to the Air and Space Museum for a day of commemoration of the 40th anniversary. We had the Apollo 11 spacecraft at the museum on exhibit. And the director of the museum decided to appoint three docents to be with the astronauts to sort of be their gophers for the day, get their coffee and lunch and, make sure they had what they needed. And fortunately, I got selected to be the docent for Mike Collins. And so I spent that entire day with the three astronauts. And that, of course, really got me excited about the Apollo program. And in fact, the cover to my book is a picture that Mike Collins took during the flight. And since my book is about John Houbolt's idea of lunar orbit rendezvous, that photograph is exactly the moment during the Apollo 11 flight when lunar orbit rendezvous occurred. When the command module was orbiting the moon, the lunar lander was on the moon with Armstrong and Aldrin, and that came up from the moon and rendezvoused with the command module. Armstrong and Aldrin got into the command module, and then the three of them came home. But that moment when they rendezvoused in lunar orbit is the picture taken by Mike Collins. And I during that day I was with him, I asked Mike Collins, what was the most memorable thing about the flight for you? Because unfortunately he did not get to walk on the moon, but he said it didn't bother him at all. He was just delighted to be on the flight. And he said, well, he says, I think taking that picture was the highlight of the entire flight, because when I took that picture, everybody who was alive in the world at that moment is in my picture. And when you think about it, there's a picture of the Earth in the background and the lunar module with Armstrong and Aldrin. And there was only one other person alive at that moment, and it was Mike Collins, and he was the one taking the picture. So he's quite proud of that photograph, and that's a great story, I think.
That brings so much perspective, and it's very cool when you say it like that, and when you think about it like that too, I don't know, it's just very cool the way you said it. I think it's really interesting to think of it in that direction. It's very interesting. That's why I love space. I feel like there's just so much with it and so much unknown, and impacts everyone here on Earth, really. It's just has such great potential in the industry. So that's what excites me all the time.
Well, space is going to be your future,
Yeah.
and the future of everybody like you. And because we're going to be going back to the moon someday, we're going to be colonizing the moon.
I know, very excited.
We're going to go to Mars someday. Although when people now ask me, when are we going to go to Mars? I always say, well, we've already been there. And of course, we saw Perseverance land a couple weeks
Yeah.
ago.
Mhm. Yeah, we technically have already been there, but I think it'd be very cool. I know there's so many ideas like about, different inventions on like gravity, like artificial gravity on space in space and all these different concepts. When I read about it, I'm like, wow, this is so cool. Like we're taking some sci-fi ideas really and making it into reality. And I think
Right,
that's the beauty of space technology.
right, right.
And so I'm really curious, how did you get into space policy? I feel like it's a very unique career, and not many people, when they go into policy, they don't really include space in it because they always are like in the direction of, just law and government. So how did you get into the space? How did you combine them together?
Well, of course, being a docent at the museum enabled me to meet a lot of people at NASA and as I said, astronauts. And a lot of times we would talk about policy issues, how things came to be and how things are going to come to be. And uh, in researching my book for John Houbolt, of course, I came across all of these other people at NASA who are in my book, who were in the policy field. They were engineers, but they were also doing policy work. And I really got interested in the whole idea of um, how NASA and this handful of really bright people were able in a very short period of time to pull together this incredibly complex project and make it work within the time frame that President Kennedy said we had to do it. And at first, as I tell in the book, at first, everybody was going in all different directions, and everybody was not agreeing with everybody. And along comes John Houbolt, who was not in the center of the management structure at NASA, and this is back in the early 60s. But he was the one that came up with this idea of how we should get to the moon. And there were other ideas that were being proposed, but Houbolt said, no, those ideas really won't work. I think mine is the only one that will. And slowly, over a period of a couple of years, he convinced everybody that he was right. And it's a great story about persistence, and to use a current word, perseverance. And he knew he was right. He stuck to it. He kept making his argument, even though at first there was a lot of hostility to him. But he kept at it, and slowly, one by one, people became convinced that he was right about this. And it was interesting to watch how the management structure of NASA came together, and probably brought about what has been America's greatest achievement to date, which is landing people on the moon. So it's a great story about how these people work together.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm curious, space policy is very unique. So did you always imagine, I know you are into space ever since you were a little kid. So did you always imagine yourself in the position you are in today, or did you have some twists and turns in your journey?
Well, I became a lawyer, and I decided to become a lawyer at a very early age. And I was determined to be a lawyer. So I, had that in mind through college and then into law school. And fortunately, I had some very good jobs as a lawyer, and a lot of fun, and they were very exciting. But I also, as you said, kept in touch with the people at NASA and kept in touch with my work at the museum. I also had, when I was in college at American University in the late 1960s, when we were going to the moon, I had a professor named Howard McCurdy, and he was a terrific professor. And in fact, he still teaches at American University 50 years later. And he's one of the people that is mentioned on the back of my book. And because he wrote a very nice comment about the book. But he teaches a course in American University's government and policy program on space policy. And every year he invites me to come and speak to his class. And I spoke to his class just a few weeks ago, and I was amazed that there were about 25 people in the class. So there are still a lot of people interested in space policy and how we go about doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I talk to my peers in high school, and I'm like, oh, have you ever considered space policy because you love law? And they didn't know it was there. So, I'm really glad to see there were so many students at the university, and there's still so many enthusiasts for space policy, because I feel like a lot of people lack awareness of these really cool careers that are in the space industry. I feel like when one thinks of space, they immediately go to just aeronautical engineering or some computer science, or you have to be like a physicist or chemist or really good science and math. And they forget the other really important jobs. I mean, we get our budget because of space policy workers. We're able to do all these really cool missions because of space policy, and marketing teams and journalists and writing. When we're actually working with private companies to build different parts. I mean, working with the advocacy sector is really important. So I think that space policy is really important.
Well, you make a very good point, because in the early days of the space program, it was obviously run by NASA, which was a government agency. But now we're seeing that private industry is getting more involved in not only making the hardware for space travel, but actually being involved in space policy. And more, I think that will occur. And as more businesses get involved in the space business and help colonize the moon, I mean, the number of opportunities to get into science and engineering and policy are going to be enormous. I mean, it's like the early days of the airplane. Believe it or not, the airplane is only about 110 years old. And when the Wright brothers made their first flight, there were only a handful of people in the world that were flying airplanes. And then within a few number of years, people who were business people and entrepreneurs realized that there was a future in the business of having airplanes. So eventually they took over by names like Bill Boeing and Donald Douglas, and now we have Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. So the same thing that's happening in the space industry now is what happened with the airplane industry 100 years ago. And now we have probably about 10,000 flights a day around the world in an airplane. So
Yeah.
imagine what that's going to lead to.
I know, I know. It excites me so much just thinking about the fact of like maybe commercialization and going to space. I think it'd be very cool if we could have, normalize going to space a little more because I feel like there's so many not only technological benefits, but I'm particularly interested in space medicine. So when I think of the discoveries and the importance of human bodies and the number of discoveries we can make in space that can translate to here on Earth, is just tremendous. And the concept gets me so excited. Back then, I'm sure they were really excited about, you can travel to different countries in a few hours. I was really exciting. And now we're thinking even larger and bigger. So I know it's possible, and I'm very excited for that.
Well, half of the astronauts that go to the space station and half of the experiments they do are medical experiments.
Yeah.
And there's always a doctor now on board the space station. And they're making just phenomenal experiments in medicine. And so that's going to obviously be the future in space too.
Yeah, I know. Space medicine, I didn't know was actually a career until a few, like two years ago, maybe, when I randomly searched it up, putting two words I like together. And so, discovering it was a real thing, it was, that's really why I'm putting this interview series is to highlight the diverse careers, whether it be because of space policy or space medicine, show kids like there's so much potential. You don't have to just work at a hospital if you like biology. You could do so much more with translational medicine, combining AI with medicine, or even taking it even further, becoming a flight surgeon. I'm definitely an aspiring astronaut, so I know that excites me.
Well, I
So,
hope you get your astronaut wings someday.
yes, thank you. So how early were your passions identified? Did they ever change over time? So I know you said you were interested in space when you were young, and you also liked law because you kind of were like, I want to be a lawyer when I grow up. So how did those two, did you ever think of a space career when you were younger?
Well, I unfortunately, and this is an honest admission. Unfortunately, I was not very good in math in elementary school and high school, and I particularly was not very good in chemistry and biology. I had a chemistry teacher that was not very good, did not inspire me, and unfortunately, therefore, I sort of took the direction of the law and policy and not the direction of science and engineering. Although I admire engineers a lot, and I had to work with a lot of them in writing this book. Uh, but I think just being around astronauts and working with people in the space business, that's enough to satisfy my interest. I still have trouble, adding two and two, but the policy side of it is very interesting. And if you're good in math and you're good in science, and if you're good, in STEM, space medicine is a great future for you because it's just gonna be an enormous need for that kind of talent.
Yeah, and just because you're not good at math or science, you can still be involved in space. And I feel like you're a perfect example for that. Even if you took law, you immersed yourself in different space concepts. You even wrote your own book, which is just amazing. So I feel like there's so much you can still do, even if you're not, really good at calculus or even just algebra, and you're not the strongest in chemistry. But I do have to say, I was talking with this professor at Princeton earlier, and she was saying how you just because you don't like a certain subject doesn't mean you're actually not interested in it, which I think is a good point. A lot of teachers, when you're in high school, you tend not to like the subject because the class is hard or the teacher is really mean. I've noticed that history has not been always my strongest area, and it's because of my teachers probably. They're not the most engaging in my opinion. So maybe that's why I have a bad opinion on history. But maybe if I had a more engaging history teacher, maybe I would have been like, oh, I love history so much. So I definitely think don't completely rule out just because you have a bad grade in the class. I think you can definitely find your passion still.
Well, I think you make a very good point. If we have a great teacher that inspires us, it's it's really important in your life to experience that and appreciate it. I had some really good teachers, particularly in history and literature. And as I commented, I didn't have particularly good teachers in science and math. But it's funny because, here I am, uh, almost 60 years after elementary school and high school. And occasionally now, what I'll read for pleasure are books about physics.
Oh,
Or occasionally, less frequently than physics, but occasionally books about math, because I become very interested in the logic of math and the logic of physics. And of course, physics is about laws, physical laws, just like the practice of law is about the laws that we make as human beings.
mhm.
And so I guess there's some connection there, but it is, Sally kind of laughs at me every now and then when I start reading my physics books because, she knows my background in math and science, but I still enjoy them very much.
Yeah, so maybe you had a hidden passion for physics that's coming out now, and I'm really glad. And it's always you always have to be open to everything, and just because you have a bad grade in something, you shouldn't completely eliminate that. You could still do something on the side with it, which definitely not ruling out humanities. I'll definitely keep it on the back. I think the concept of anything related to space policy is really cool. So, yeah, and so
Good.
I'm curious. Oh yeah, what were you gonna say?
No, no, I was just going to say the other interest I've had all these years, and I guess this is item number three, is Shakespeare. I've always been fascinated by Shakespeare and all the plays, and of course, he was probably our greatest writer ever.
Yeah.
And his understanding of human nature was just unbelievable. So that's been my other passion.
Wow. Have you ever considered theater? I know yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was involved at one time with the Shakespeare Theater and knew a lot of people who worked there. And I've always been a frustrated actor, and most lawyers are, of course, but I never could quite master the ability to remember hundreds of lines and
Oh,
and be
yeah.
able to recite them.
Yeah.
So that kind of killed my acting career. But
Yeah.
I admire actors. I think it's a real talent to do what they
Yeah.
do, and so that's been another passion of mine.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually didn't know that. And so were there any obstacles to pursuing your passion? And if so, how did you overcome them? I'm sure there were obstacles, but were there anything that were major that maybe like changed your path or made you rethink some of your steps?
Well, that's a great question. There are always going to be obstacles, no matter what road you're walking down. And achieving your life's goal is really it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You have to take each thing at the moment and overcome. When you think about a runner who is running a race, a hurdle race, and they have to jump over 10 or 12 hurdles to get to the end of the race, they have to do each hurdle one at a time. And they can't be thinking about the third hurdle down the way because they've got to get over the one that's right in front of them. So I think as you go through life and you meet these hurdles, and some hurdles will be higher than others, um, that you do the best you can to deal with them, work around them, overcome them, and then get on to the next one. Um, it's always helpful to have a good mentor, someone who's been down the road before and can tell you what might be there to watch out for and to help guide you along the way. But if you have your mind set on something, you just stay with it. I mean, look at John Houbolt. I mean, he had his mind set on convincing NASA to do lunar orbit rendezvous for Project Apollo, and he had lots of hurdles thrown up to him, and he just overcame each one at a time, and he
Not giving
eventually
up.
got to the end of the race and he won the race.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's amazing life lesson almost, never to give up and to always find that supportive community around you and mentors who can support you. I know like, throughout my journey, you getting into space medicine and getting space industry, both my parents are not into space. So they, when I told them I was interested in this is the industry I want to go into, they were first a little shocked because both of them knew nothing about really space. They would always take me to the Air and Space Museum because we're like an hour and a half away, but they weren't really space enthusiasts because they didn't know too much about it. So, I was always trying to seek out after, mentors, working with like Girl Scout community and people who could just help me, achieve my goals. So I definitely agree that having that support system is important, but as well as just not giving up and persisting is always will always lead you to the destination that you want to go to.
Absolutely. And I had a lot of good mentors along the way for me, both in law and mentors at the museum. And you just learn from them. They have far more experience. They're not always right, but most of the time they are. And it's great to have somebody who can help guide you through some of the difficult times. And they're going to be difficult times. There always will be, no matter what age or what stage of life you're in. And again, I think you just, like John Houbolt, you just face that challenge that's right in front of you. You deal with it. You convince or get over whatever it is that's holding you up, and you move on to the next one.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Thank you for sharing that with us. So, was there an internship or volunteer role, apart from the museum, of course, that assisted you in achieving your dreams in terms of law or space policy?
Well, when I was in law school, many, many, many years ago, I had the good fortune to clerk for a judge, and the judge was a real inspiration for me when it came to the law. And he was, a mentor, clearly, even though he was also my boss. And then I met all through college and law school a number of teachers that were supportive and helped me along. And like I was saying, with relying on mentors, like I was saying a moment ago, when you see somebody come along during your schooling or your work, and they're going to be an inspiration for you, really treasure that opportunity to work with them and meet them and get to know them and take their advice. And there were a handful of people as I went through life that were like that for me, and I think helped open some doors and get me over hurdles. And it worked out well.
Yeah, I'm really glad it did. And when you were in college, now that you've always been part of the space industry, and when you're in the industry, it's easier to, gain information and keep up with what's happening in the space industry. And now, even when you're retired, you're, continuously active. You're volunteering, doing a bunch of interviews, very active, on your social media, I'm sure. So, how do you keep your skills current while managing all of the side activities that you do and anticipate changes in the space industry?
Well, being associated with the museum, and particularly in a leadership level with the docents, we're given opportunities all the time to learn about new things in space policy or space engineering or space medicine. We're presented with dozens of programs, mostly through Zoom and webinars, that we can go to learn. And of course, this is so different than it was just 10 years ago or more, because before the internet and before all of the information that's, in your hands, we didn't have that. You had to either go to a library or go to some place to actually get the information. But now access to information is so easy uh, that anything you wanted to learn about any subject, you can just sit down and take the time and do it. And fortunately, the museum is very good about continuously training its core of docents, because our job is to talk about space to the public, to all
Yeah.
of you. So we have to know what we're talking about to be able to convey it to you. And therefore, the museum does a great job of training us. I went through extensive training when I first became a docent, and we get continuous training. We have a training session every month. All of the docents, all 300 docents who are associated with the museum. We do now it's a Zoom training once a month where we're brought up to speed on all the new developments in space.
That's awesome.
And I mean, we're learning about what the new spacesuits in space are going to be like, robotics, how robotics are going to be part of the space program. So there's a lot of exciting stuff out there.
Yeah, oh, when you mentioned robotics, it reminds me, I was reading something earlier and it was like about artificial intelligence resolving conflicts of astronauts in space and the way we're using innovations that we make here on Earth to help us in space, but then also the innovations we develop for space helping here us on Earth is just amazing. I feel like we've progressed so much to do so well together, and the technology we invent in space for space and here on Earth for different things are balancing out really well. And I'm so excited to see so much integration of different fields together. One person was saying space is a place, literally meaning like it's its own different world with, every single thing that we need here on Earth is needed in space. So every career is vital. And so the different concepts and topics are so expansive. And so I'm sure through your training, you learn so much about it.
Particularly in computer technology. I mean, you mentioned AI and astronaut work. I mean, there are a number of companies now trying to develop software for the computers that astronauts have in space, that when they're confronted with an emergency or a problem, when you're in space, you don't have a lot of time to figure things out. You're going around the world at 5 miles per second, and you have to make decisions in a very short period of time. And they're now developing software where the astronauts can put into the computer all of the key information about the situation they're confronting, and the computer then will using experience and incidents of the past, they will come out with almost within a minute a recommendation for the astronauts. So what's the best course of action? Now, we certainly didn't have that when we started the space program 50 years ago. But now when we go to the moon, and certainly when we go to Mars, astronauts are going to need technology like that. So all of this stuff is being developed at an enormous speed. And it's just so exciting that it's going to, to help human beings do so much more in such a shorter period of time. So it is an exciting period to be in.
Yeah, artificial intelligence is amazing. I think, trying to integrate that more into like space or rockets and, spaceships when you're in the ISS or whether you're actually just in orbit. I think utilizing that even a further and bigger scale in order to prevent any accidents that happen or to protect the astronauts' health. I think everything is starting to be integrated more in a larger scale. And yeah, I think, it's a very exciting time to be involved in artificial intelligence in space. So yeah.
I'll give you an example. You probably don't remember this because it happened a while ago, but when the Challenger accident occurred, when it launched with the school teacher, and unfortunately it exploded during launch. The cause of that explosion was cold weather. The weather was just too cold for some of the parts to properly work during the launch. And before the launch, there was a big debate within the policymakers at NASA about whether to launch or not that day. And some people strongly said, no, if you launch, there'll be a problem. Other people said, no, we think it'll be okay. In today's world, when a problem like that comes up in front of NASA, they put all that information into their computers, and the computer comes out and says, no, you probably shouldn't launch, or it would be okay. Now, it's interesting how that technology enables us to probably make the right decision.
Yeah.
And that's a
And when
good
we
thing.
made it, when we
That's a
made the
good thing.
technology.
Right. That's a good thing. But remember, it is still the policymakers that have to put the information into the computer for it to think and resolve what the issue is. And so, I mean, that's a good example of how, 40 years ago, things were so different than it is today. And, but there's a great future in every field in space.
Definitely for every field, there is, such growth because, there's something that I read, a while back, and it was saying how if you people used to think back then by automating factories that you would lose jobs and there would be less jobs. But if you think about it, there have been way more job development and more efficient tasks that have been done that allowed us to spend time on other things. So, implementing technology like this will not lose the importance of other jobs that are currently in place, but it'll allow us to do more and work more efficiently, discover more, and explore more. So definitely keeping that into perspective and encouraging this growth instead of being afraid of it is important.
Of course, the big challenge with space policy today is, and you mentioned the key word budget. To do all of these things in space, we have to have the resources and the funding to do it. And space is expensive, and particularly human space flight is expensive. And therefore, policymakers here on Earth have to decide how much money they're going to devote to space exploration, because as we know, there's so many other problems here on Earth that we need to be funding, hunger and food issues and schools and climate change and all of that. And that's the real challenge for policymakers now in space, is to convince the funders that space is a good investment in the future. It does create jobs, and human beings are always going to want to explore. It's just a question of whether you can do it now or you have to do it later. And that's the real policy issue now in space, apart from the technical issues like science and technology and metallurgy and computers and so forth. Just the whole idea of budgetary funding for space is
Yeah.
a big issue. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like now I'm meeting, like, I learned about a lot of private companies that are, have missions to create 1 billion jobs in the space industry, or, further it with private companies, new startups. And we're no longer limited at the point where it's just a government agency like we were talking about earlier. Now there's a lot of private organizations, whether it be big ones like SpaceX or, like Lockheed Martin or Blue Origin. There's a lot of other smaller ones that are starting to form in order to provide those space jobs and space careers, and consulting firms and companies. And so there's so much going on. And I think being able to provide that insight to people who are not necessarily as immersed in the space industry is so vital, because everyone is involved in space, whether they know it or not. And being able to convey that is very imperative. So I definitely see the importance of space policy and, huge need for it.
Of course, the other big policy issue, apart from funding that we're talking about, is do we cooperate with other nations in the future to do all this? Yeah, as I said, human spaceflight is extremely expensive.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think in the future, particularly when we probably go to Mars, there'll be much more international cooperation, because one country like the United States or China or Russia is not going to be able to fund a trip to Mars all by itself. It's going to have to cooperate with other nations. So I think the first flight to Mars will be an international crew. It'll be internationally funded. And the really good thing about that is that I think it's going to help bring nations together. That's another big challenge in the policy world.
Yeah, that's actually a really great prediction. I wasn't really thinking about it in like those terms and those aspects. I think, we've always considered space to be a very collaborative environment. However, we started space, through the space race between Russia and the US. And, of course, more insight was in the book. And I think, if you think about it, a lot of it started because of political
Right.
power and trying to be the most dominant country. And it was more of a competition rather than working to work together to foster a more scientific community to explore. Now, we're thinking of it differently now, but back then it wasn't. So I think, stepping forward from that and trying to create that collaborative environment is a huge jump. So I really hope we can do something that is international collaboration for the Mars mission. I think it would be amazing if we could do that.
And not only is it going to be necessary to do that, but it's going to be a good thing to do that, because I
Yeah.
think it will bring countries together
Yeah.
to work. And once we are able to do that in the field of space, we can start doing it in the field of hunger and climate change and housing and education.
Mhm.
So space has always been at the forefront of a lot of these developments, and I think it will continue to be more so as time goes on.
Yeah, I think that this was a great conversation. I think that would really, gave me new ideas, new thoughts, and fresh perspectives from someone who's actually in more involved in the government aspect of things to think in those terms. I really think international collaboration will be necessary and very good for humanity as a whole.
Yep.
And so, yeah, and so my last question for you to kind of wrap this interview together is what advice do you have for young people regarding their pursuit of a passion in the STEM field or the space industry? Something that you wish you when you were, younger, maybe a high school student or a college student or the beginning of their career phases. What advice would you give?
Well, it kind of covers some of the things we've talked about. Seek out and cherish mentors that can help you along in developing your passion for a particular field. Um, Accomplishing anything, whether it is going to the moon or acting in a play or writing a book, requires a lot of hard work. And uh, recognize that to reach a goal, you're going to have to really roll up your sleeves and work hard to do it. And as we said, you'll have hurdles along the way, but deal with them one at a time. Some may set you back a little bit or set you on a slightly different course, but do the best you can to adjust to those obstacles and hurdles, and just again, to be the John Houbolt of the story, be persistent and persevere in what you want to do, and you'll eventually get there.
I think that's a perfect statement. Be your own John Houbolt. I think it's really important for everyone to always remember if you have a passion to just follow it. I know there are going to be obstacles. I know when I was starting Ignited Thinkers, I felt like every day was a new obstacle. Every time I was like, oh, I have to do this or something's going to happen with this. And I'm continuously having obstacles. And it's always a matter of just pushing through and continuously following your dreams, whether it be through academics, your own career goals, or research projects or internships that you want to apply for. Always just finding that supportive community and go through every hurdle or every obstacle one step at a time.
I mean,
So
that's essentially the John Houbolt story, right?
yeah, yeah. And so I would, thank you so much, Mr. Ghazi, for taking some time to do this wonderful interview. I think, this book really encapsulated a lot of the things that we talked about, whether in terms of the political scheme or the importance of perseverance. And, it really sheds light on so many important things and taught me so many things I didn't know before. So I would really like to
Good.
thank you for writing this book for all of us and also taking your time to share your space journey because it truly is inspirational.
Well, thank you for having me, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.